is on KQED Forum. So are you up to that level of streaming, do you think? You are. Well, that's good.
Dozens of people around the world watching over the course of about a 5-year period. So we do pretty good that way.
Good, good,
They
good.
love us in Sweden for some reason, so that seems just fine.
Well,
And this building itself is a sort of hotbed Midwestern socialist kind of background to this building. So that's a good thing. All right, so I won't do any real fancy introduction, but this is Professor Emeritus Robert Cherny was teaching at San Francisco State for quite some time until apparently he got busy because 3 books have been released this year, right?
no, just 2 this year.
Oh, I saw
2 this year and 1 last year.
Well,
yeah.
What's the release date on the Bridges?
23.
Oh, okay. Well, my distributor lies to me. It's in January of 24. So he's actually been coasting. But, once he got in 24, San Francisco Reds came out in mid-year, and Coit Tower Murals was done, and came out about November.
Yep.
So, all right. So this one's focused on the Coit Tower Murals book, and on what's our date? The 23rd, I think, of January. It's a Thursday. Maybe you shouldn't trust me till I look it up. But yeah, there will be another talk focusing on San Francisco Reds. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I sometimes say that I had to retire to get my work done because I had started all of these projects when I was teaching, and then I ended up with a lot of university responsibilities, and I could never get my research written up. And so it really took retirement to be able to finish these various projects. This is the most recent one. I thought maybe I would read a few things here and there, and try to connect them to the larger picture. I assume most of you have seen the Coit Tower murals, have you? Is there anyone who has not? They're just such a fixture of San Francisco life. There are full-color photographs of them all here for those people who are at Coit Tower for the first time and maybe the only time, and they want to take these color photos back. That's my publisher's hope. But what I was interested in this book was not just selling it to the tourists at Coit Tower, although I thought that was a good idea, but I wanted to really do a good history of what happened there, why they were painted, how they were painted, and especially the politics that accompanied them and persisted for years and years after they were completed. There were still people in the 1950s who wanted to destroy those murals because they were communist propaganda, so-called. I mean, that was their perspective. So the whole story starts, of course, with the Great Depression, beginning with the stock market crash in 1929. It became very serious in San Francisco. Is that the mic that's rumbling?
I think your phone may be connected to someone, sir.
Is your phone live? Maybe your phone is, maybe somebody thinks maybe it's coming from here. No?
No, I don't know. Okay. Well, in the midst of the Great Depression in San Francisco, Coit Tower, the building, was dedicated as a memorial to Lily Hitchcock Coit. That's where Coit comes from, Coit Tower.
We do have something very odd.
Yeah, there's some.
There's a sound coming from you, sir. I'm not sure. There's some sound
Something somewhere. My phone? I don't know. Maybe try turning it up. Yeah, I think I hear something. Yeah, so try turning that off. Yeah, just turn it off. Okay. All right. Well, that was odd. I thought it was little rodents. Do you have enough light to read by? I realize when I turn this off, it's not very
I think it'll be okay. We'll see.
Take a peek at that text and make sure.
Sure.
since we have this going on anyway.
Yeah, let's see here.
Okay. Yeah, you should just be able to hang that up or turn off the power.
Yeah, this will be okay, I think.
Okay, good. Good.
So let's see. Great Depression. San Francisco probably wasn't as bad off as Pittsburgh or Detroit, but San Francisco was hit very seriously by the Great Depression. Probably 25% unemployment at its peak in the city. And in the midst of all that, a new president took office. Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in March of 1933 and immediately launched a whole series of programs to try to deal with the Great Depression. One of those programs was the Emergency Relief Act of 1933, which was first intended to give money to states to provide work relief to the unemployed. But part of that money was carved back late in 1933 to create the Public Works of Art project, specifically to provide work for unemployed artists. The money was channeled down to the local level. There was a local director and a local committee who solicited local artists to work for the Public Works of Art project. Among those in San Francisco who did take advantage of that were 25 lead artists and about the same number of assistants who were assigned to work at Coit Tower. All of the Public Works of Art project participants were told that they were supposed to paint the American scene, which was an approach to artwork that had developed in the previous decade, but it really meant painting ordinary people doing ordinary things, everyday Americans at work or at leisure. And that, it was thought, would accomplish a second goal of the Public Works of Art project. The first goal was to provide work for unemployed artists. The second goal was to democratize art, to lift art out of the rather ethereal realm that public art often had in public buildings, and create images that ordinary people could relate to as a way of democratizing public art. And you really see both of these very clearly at Coit Tower, because the artwork there is an excellent example of the American scene. The artists talked among themselves. They were told to paint the American scene, and what they decided to do was to depict the Bay Area in 1933, 1934, to depict what was going on around them at the moment they were painting. And that's what those murals all show. They show life in this area, especially San Francisco, in late 1933, 1934, just as they were being painted. So let's see if I can, I think I have to take off my glasses to read. If I take off my glasses, I really can't see you very well, but I can see this better. So in 1964, Bernard Zackheim was being interviewed about what life was like here in the Depression. He said, the artists were in a terrible financial condition. And he recounted how one was cleaning toilets for a living while he had a one-man show at the Legion of Honor. And another one was threatening to commit suicide because he had nothing to eat. So the Public Works of Art project was really a lifesaver for the artists in this area. As I said, there was a local committee that selected local artists to work at Coit Tower. But they also were careful to pick people, especially at Coit Tower, who were good artists. So there were several of the artists there who also taught at the California School of Fine Arts, which is later the San Francisco Art Institute. Ralph Stackpole and Lucien LeBeau and Raymond Boynton all were faculty members there. Many of the other artists had been students there. So that school was a very important part of the arts scene in San Francisco. I'm going to give, so they all started work in December, late December 1933, especially beginning to put things on the walls in January of 1934. So I'll read you another little section here. While the murals were being executed, the tower was a busy and crowded place, especially in the first month or more, when all the artists were working from scaffolds, usually with powerful portable lighting. We have photographs of all of this. They had to be on scaffolds because the kind of painting they were doing, it makes it necessary to work from the top down. This type of painting involves applying pigment to wet plaster. It's an unusual technique, but it was one that had been popularized in the 1920s by the Mexican muralists, most notably Diego Rivera. And Rivera had been here a few years before. He did a big mural at what is now the City Club. It was then part of the Stock Exchange. And he did a big one at the California School of Fine Arts. Both of these are now city landmarks. But that meant that the people in this area, the artists in this area, were familiar with his technique and with his approach. And when the artists talked among themselves before they started work at Coit Tower, they agreed that they would use the palette of Diego Rivera and they would use the style of Diego Rivera. And some art historians have said, and I'm quoting, no, I'll quote from the back of the book. No, it's not. They didn't use that one. A prominent art historian said that Coit Tower is really the best example in the U.S. of the influence of Diego Rivera on American artists. So here's what was going on. A busy and crowded place, especially in the first month when they were all working from scaffolds because they had to start from the top of the painting. In addition to the 25 master artists, the 20-some assistant artists, the several plasterers, and there were also 7 laborers and a few volunteers, and then several park department employees. More than 60 people in all crowded into that small space, if you can imagine that, for those of you who have been there. And in addition, reporters, because there's constant coverage in the newspapers, and curious members of the public. Eventually, they just said that the members of the public couldn't come in because it was just too crowded there. So it was a busy, crowded place. The artists, most of them were acquainted with each other before they started work there. And as a result, they got along very well. And I'm going to give you a little section about some of their recollections about it. Edith Hamlin did one of the murals upstairs. She later recalled, quote, a great camaraderie among the artists, unquote. Ralph Chessy, who also did one of the murals upstairs, remembered that they all had what he called picnic lunches together at noontime. One of the assistants, Hebe Daum, said, we'd buy big slabs of cheese and salami and bread. You know, Coit Tower, you know what they were doing. They were just going down the hill to one of the Italian delicatessens or stores. And break off the bread and sit around talking. Otis Oldfield, who was also one of the artists, said that when anyone finished, they would just all celebrate with sherry or wine, which as of 1934 had been legal for only about 4 or 5 months because Prohibition had just come to an end at the year before. And by the way, when you go to Coit Tower and look at those murals, you'll see in several of the murals references to the fact that wine is now available and legally available. It was never not available in San Francisco, of course. Late in the process, there was a serious controversy that developed. My subtitle is New Deal Art and Political Controversy in San Francisco. And the first controversy arose in June of 1934 after the artists had just finished the largest murals. They were all supposed to finish up by April 28, and because that's when the money ran out. This was just a short project. The Public Works of Art project was a short project to get them through the winter. And the money ended on April 28. Not everyone was finished with their mural on April 28. And so the overall director of the local PWAP was able to get money from the state for them all to finish. And so there were about 5 of them who had to get that extra money. And the last of them finished up probably in early June. And so on June 23rd, Arthur Brown Jr., the architect of Coit Tower, came up to take a look. There'd been an article in the newspaper about how the artists had just putting on their final touches. And so he went up to take a look, and he exploded when he saw a hammer and sickle and the slogan, "Workers of the World Unite," painted over one of the west windows. Arthur Brown Jr. had not liked the idea of modernist art in his building to begin with, but he had sort of seen Coit Tower as a trade-off. He definitely didn't want it in the Opera House. And if you know the art that's in the Opera House, it's nothing like the art in Coit Tower. So apparently Arthur Brown Jr. thought, okay, we'll let them have Coit Tower for their modernist art, but we're going to keep it out of the Opera House. But when he got there and he saw the hammer and sickle over the west window, he immediately contacted Herbert Fleischacker, who was the president of the Parks Commission, which had responsibility for Coit Tower. And Fleischacker was also a member of the Art Commission, which had responsibility for the artwork there. And Fleischacker got in touch with Walter Heil, who was the director of the De Young Museum and also the director of the PWAP in this district, and said, do something about this. And so telegrams flew back and forth between San Francisco and Washington about what do we do? What do we do? And eventually, Edward Bruce, who was in charge of the overall PWAP in Washington, said, regarding the Coit Tower tempest in a teapot over the communist symbols, I agree that it is a silly business, and I have suggested to them that the best way to clean it up is to destroy that painting. A smart Alex situation like that gives me a pain in the neck. Well, of course, but the Art Commission had this hot potato dumped in their lap. What do they do with this? What do they do with it? And so they appointed a special committee to go and look at all of the art in Coit Tower and give them a recommendation. And this committee reported back that, well, the things over the windows don't really fit very well with the rest of the artwork, because the rest of the murals are all representational, but the things over the windows are symbolic. And so in order to maintain the integrity of the artwork, you have to take off everything above the windows, including the hammer and sickle. And that was done. We don't know who did it or when. There's no record of that. But it's clear that the only way that you can remove that kind of a painting, a fresco painting, is to just break out the plaster. Because this kind of painting means that the paint is not on the wall. The paint becomes part of the wall. When the plaster dries, the pigment just becomes part of the wall. And it maintains its color really well as a result. So you go there and you'll see really bold colors. but it also means that you can't just paint over it because it's still going to be there. So, and we know that they broke out the plaster because about 15 years ago or so, there was a major restoration of all of the works at Coit Tower. And I later talked to the woman who was overall in charge of that project, and I asked her. Well, she said that one of the things they had done was to take off all the subsequent layers of paint over the trim and the ceiling, not the art itself, but everything around it, to get back to the original colors. They wanted to do a restoration that matched the original colors. And so I asked her, when you took off all these layers of paint, did you find anything over the windows? Nope. So they had clearly broken out the plaster, replastered it, and painted it. And apparently they did two other things. And this doesn't appear in any of the minutes of the Art Commission. But the mural by John Langley Howard, those of you who can picture the murals there, there's a group of very angry-looking men on one side of the mural, on the, probably not accidentally, the left side of the mural as you face it. And one of them is holding a newspaper, and the newspaper that he was holding was the Western Worker, the newspaper of the Communist Party. And it would have had the banner that read the Western Worker, and in the middle of it a little hammer and sickle. It's completely painted out. If you go there today and look at it, the man is holding something, and you can see some of the headlines in the paper, but you can't see any of it. John Langley Howard later said they just covered it up with house paint. And I don't know if it's actually house paint, but it's covered. Bernard Zackheim also had the Western Worker in his mural. He put a lot of newspapers in his mural, because that was a way to really depict everyday life. People at that time all read newspapers, unlike today. When people get their news, I don't know how they get their news today. I still read a newspaper. Probably some of you do too. Anyway, but at that time, virtually everybody read a daily newspaper. And so putting lots of newspapers into their murals was a way of bringing in the current events. So they would put in the newspaper, and they'd have headlines here and there. There's one about Franklin Roosevelt telling Congress he's a tough guy. And there's one about somebody violating some of the National Recovery Act provisions and so forth. So there's a lot of things in these newspapers in the Coit Tower murals that connect to everyday life in 1934. Bernard Zackheim's Western Worker still says Western Worker, but the hammer and sickle seems to have gotten very blurry. So there's no hammer and sickles visible in any of the murals. That was the first political controversy at Coit Tower, but there were more to come. In 1941, one of the park commissioners was very upset, and here I'm going to quote to you from a newspaper article about Commissioner Lerman. He was, quote, spluttering with rage and saying that some of the murals were, quote, objectionable, awful, terrible, and communistic, definitely calculated to arouse class hatred. And that mural by John Langley Howard that shows the men marching, he called terrible and awful. He said that those men epitomize hatred. One can see murder in their hearts. And he said that Bernard Zackheim's library included, quote, non-patriotic books. And so he wanted whole parts of those murals to be broken out, to be destroyed. And the Park Commission gave in and unanimously passed a resolution to the Arts Commission recommending that the Arts Commission approve breaking out parts of 3 murals. When the Arts Commission got this resolution, which I assume they didn't even enter it in their minutes. They just ignored it. And then a few weeks later, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and everybody kind of forgot about what was going on at Coit Tower, at least until the 1950s. But I want to read you one more quote from what happened in 1941. Ralph Stackpole was one of the artists at Coit Tower. He did the big mural of industrial scenes that faces the west window. And here's what he said in 1941 about the murals. The Coit Tower murals are dated 1934. The national disaster was in 1929, and anyone with memory can recall the struggle and effort to get out of that mess. The work at Coit Tower was a little part of the recovery effort. Among 25 artists, as among 25 other people, there were differences in beliefs and ideas. If some artist read Karl Marx, can you blame him? It was 1934, and artists like everyone else searching for better conditions. And then he says, I think the Honorable Park Commissioner should forget the idea of having them removed. Prejudices grow. They might even grow to the actual point of having the murals destroyed. Then next would come the books. Anyone reading that in 1941 would know exactly what he's talking about. Next would come the books, because everyone had, in 1941, who kept up with the news would have had vivid memories of the Nazis burning books in the 1930s. Nothing was done in 1941. In the early 1950s, during the McCarthy era, there were letters to the editor about the communist murals at Coit Tower. Somebody needs to do something about it. Nobody said a word in any public commission. They just ignored it. And eventually, the Coit Tower murals became a beloved city landmark. They've been restored several times. One of the problems in the 1950s was that anyone, of course, can still walk in. That was true then. But people walked in and carved their initials in the murals, if you can imagine that. These are just painted on plaster, right? So you take a pocket knife or a key even, you can just gouge out the plaster and make your initials. And they seriously damaged some of the murals. So there was a big restoration effort in the 1950s. Some of the artists restored their own murals in the 1950s. There was another major restoration in the 1990s. There's been one continuing problem with the murals that no one has quite resolved, and that's a problem of efflorescence. Efflorescence develops on the surface of the murals when water works its way through from behind. And it deposits, and then as the water comes through the plaster, it deposits a kind of white film on the mural itself. And that's called efflorescence. The water is coming from a leak in the roof. And that's Arthur Brown Jr.'s fault, because it's a fault in the original design. I talked to the architect who did a major effort to fix that roof about 15 years ago. And he said, it's just built into the design of the building. They did everything they could. But the last time I was there, I saw a little bit of efflorescence. So whatever they did, it didn't succeed. And so it's an ongoing problem. So let's see, what did I want to? Oh, yes, here's what I want to do. I wanted to read you a quote here from 1992, after a big restoration took place in 1992. This is a quote from Chiori Santiago, who was a local art critic, and she wrote a magazine article in 1992, and she described Coit Tower this way, quote, "Our Statue of Liberty, our Parthenon, our Sistine Chapel. It is as much a portrait of another era as those world-class monuments." And by then, by 1992, it had already become a city landmark. It's city landmark number 165. I only want to read one or two more things, and then I'm going to take your questions. One of the things that's interested me about the murals was what those artists did later. Now, the Public Works of Art project was the first New Deal art project. It ended in April of 1934, but almost immediately, Edward Bruce, who had been in charge of the PWAP, launched a new federal program to put art in federal buildings. It was called the Treasury Section of Fine Arts. And they were responsible for putting artwork in federal buildings all over the country. One of the things that the New Deal did to stimulate the economy was to put up a lot of new buildings, especially post offices. There were post offices scattered all over the country, and virtually every post office built in the 1930s has a mural. So many of you have probably been to Rincon, what used to be Rincon Annex. It's now Rincon Center. That's an example of the kinds of murals that were put in post offices. It's a pretty spectacular example. It's the largest work by a single artist in any of the federal Treasury Section art projects. But it's the sort of thing that was done in post offices and new federal courthouses and such all across the country. There was another work relief program as well, in which federal money through the WPA financed art projects at the local level. So those artists who started at Coit Tower, some of whom had never done this kind of work before, often found later employment through one of the other New Deal art programs. And by my calculations, there were more than 100 public art projects subsequently done in the 1930s by the people who started at Coit Tower. Post offices and schools and federal courthouses all around this area, all up and down this area, and also in other parts of the country, some in Los Angeles and several in Texas. So Coit Tower was a beginning for many of these artists. Many of these artists then were able to make their reputations not only by doing this kind of work relief or commissions from the Treasury section, but they began getting private commissions to do murals as well. So there were a number of them who also did private commissions in places like hotels and the Chamber of Commerce offices and so forth. There are some famous ones in a brewery, in fact. So I will close. I will about to wrap up, but I want to read you. And there were other controversies about New Deal art that I go into in the book, but I want to read you one of my concluding paragraphs. Perhaps the most important lesson to take away from the San Francisco experience is that New Deal art should be preserved, regardless of the objections of today's critics. Public officials should not destroy yesterday's public art because that would deprive people tomorrow from drawing their own conclusions about the art. When I was teaching, I always used to tell my students that people in the past do not think the way we think today. And the corollary of that is people in the future are not going to think the way we think today. If we destroy something from the past today, we are denying those in the future their opportunity to make up their own mind about it. New Deal art, considered in the context of its time and with appreciation for the intent of the artist, will continue to be reinterpreted in the future. But that will not happen if the art is destroyed. And I will also then, before I take your questions, read you the epigram. I first quoted Ralph Stackpole. Prejudices grow. They might even grow to the actual point of having the murals destroyed. Then next would come the books. And then I quote from PEN America. In the 2022-23 school year, from July 1st, 2022 to June 31st, 2023, PEN America recorded 3,362 instances of book bans in the U.S. public school classrooms and libraries. Those bans removed student access to 1,557 unique book titles, the works of over 1,480 authors, illustrators, and translators. PEN America recorded 1,406 book bans in Florida, followed by 625 bans in Texas, 333 bans in Missouri, 281 bans in Utah, and 186 bans in Pennsylvania. Okay. I'm happy to take your questions. I've gone sort of lightly over much of what's in the book, so if you have questions about any of it, please ask away. Let's.
Do you know what, besides the hammer and sickle, what else was above some of the windows?
Yes, I know some of it. Over the west windows, there are 3 windows on each side, you know. Over the west windows, it started at the south end with a $sign and the slogan, "In God We Trust," which the artist Clifford White said symbolized rugged capitalism. Over the middle window, he had a suspension bridge, because if you look out that window, you can see the Golden Gate Bridge under construction. He put a suspension bridge, and in the center, he put the blue eagle of the NRA, the major symbol of the New Deal. And then over the northmost window, he put the hammer and sickle and the slogan, "In God We Trust." Over the east windows, the same artist, we have his drawings. We don't have photographs of this, but we have his sketches. The east windows all deal with agriculture. And so over the east windows, he had an ear of corn, he had a cow's head, he had a sheep's head. And they're just line drawings, just like the ones he put over the west windows. We have no idea what was over the south windows, but the artist on that, who did the tall figures on either side of the south windows, Harold Mallet Dean, was responsible for putting something over the top of those windows, and we have no photograph. We don't have any idea what was there. Yeah, Michael.
So you talk quite a bit about the sort of the communist political, sort of renderings of in the art. Does this mean that most or all of the artists were in fact communists in terms of their political leanings or membership, or was it how broad? Was this? And sort of part 2 of my question is, what was the stance of government towards, people who were members of the Communist Party in the 1930s? And, I'm thinking about later on in the 50s when they were actively persecuted. So I'm sort of wondering how that stood in 1934.
Okay, well, let me sort of take different parts of that, and if I leave out part of your question, you come back to it. There were 3 artists who depicted anything having to do with the Communist Party, 3 out of 25. Bernard Zockheim put the Western Worker in his set of newspapers in the public library, and he had a person modeled on John Langley Howard, one of the other artists, taking a book off the shelf, and the book happened to be Marx's Das Kapital. Victor Arnautoff had a newsstand with all kinds of publications on it, including the Daily Worker and Masses, two Communist Party publications. He didn't get into trouble about it. I mean, people noticed it, but he wasn't asked to do anything about it. And John Langley Howard had the Western Worker banner. And so those three, plus Clifford White's symbol over the window, so that makes a total of 4 artists. Now, what was their relationship to the Communist Party? Well, you know, I've done this whole book about the Communist Party in the Bay Area. And to the best of my knowledge, Bernard Zackheim was a member, but he kept it secret at the time. He wouldn't even tell his own agent that he was a party member. He denied it, in fact, when he was asked point blank. I did find much later in the 1950s that he got thrown out at some point. Victor Arnautoff was not a member at that time. I know from Victor Arnautoff's FBI file when he joined, because, you know, the FBI knew these things probably better than he himself knew, because he, in his later life, he emigrated to the Soviet Union. He was born in Russia. After he retired, he moved back. He said he felt himself an unwelcome guest in America because of his politics. But he remembered that he had joined in 1937. The FBI said it was 1938 because they had seen the actual record. So I took the FBI's word rather than his memory of the date. But which is to say, he was not a member in 1934. And in his memoirs, he said that he was radicalized by the police action against the Longshore strikers in 1934, which came in July. He had finished his mural well before that. And that he was radicalized by the Spanish Civil War, and that was what led him to join the Communist Party. So he may have been sort of leaning in that direction. There's no indication that anyone else among the artists was a party member. John Langley Howard later said in the late 1930s that he had been trying to depict the contrast between wealth and poverty that existed in 1934. And his mural is really the only one in all of Coit Tower that does draw that kind of a contrast between wealth and poverty. But he also said that he was really trying to do that, but that he decided that you can't really do that in art, and that it was a mistake for him to have done it. I've gone into a little bit of more extended analysis in the book about the politics of some of the artists there. I think that Clifford White was clearly on the left. I don't see any clear indication that he actually was a party member, however. And one of the reasons for my conclusion is that he had worked very closely with Diego Rivera after Rivera had been expelled. And when someone is expelled from the party, other party members are supposed to avoid them. But White worked as an assistant to Diego Rivera when Rivera was in San Francisco in 1930-31, and then when he went on to Detroit in 1932. White was a translator and a secretary as well as an artistic assistant. So the fact that he continued his close association with Rivera at a time that Rivera had been expelled from the Mexican Communist Party says to me that White was not a party member himself, but could be on the left. Obviously, putting up the hammer and sickle and the slogan, "Workers of the World Unite," you have to assume that his politics are over there on the left somewhere. Like Rivera's were, you know. Rivera got expelled from the Mexican Communist Party, but his politics stayed very much on the left. You know, after he left San Francisco, he went to Detroit. He did some amazing, spectacular murals at the Detroit Institute of Art. And then he went to New York, and he was doing work in New York as well. And there was a big exhibition of Rivera's work at SF MoMA a couple of years ago. Some of you may have seen it there. And one of the things that he did when he was in New York that really said something to me was that he showed a left fist salute. That's a Trotskyist salute. This is a Stalinist salute. So that's, I think that's where Rivera's politics probably were at that point. And of course, he later associated with Trotsky in Mexico. So did I answer the various parts of your question?
Just one part is, what was the government's stance
Yes.
towards, their politics?
Right. Well, of course, Edward Bruce in Washington was very upset with this. He said something like, you know, I have nothing against communist symbolism. It just doesn't belong in this context. It doesn't belong being done with federal money because they're going to endanger future funding for public art. His major concern was that this was a political problem for public art in the future. In the late 1930s, beginning around, well, certainly in San Francisco, beginning in 1934 with the Longshore Strike, there was a little mini Red Scare that was going on in June and July and August of 1934 here in San Francisco, because the corporate executives in the who handled ocean shipping and dealt with the Longshore Union on the docks accused the leaders of that strike of being communists, especially Harry Bridges. And there were a few communists who were involved in that union. I wrote a whole book about Harry Bridges, and I don't want to go into it all because I have 2 entire chapters in that book about Harry Bridges' politics. So in San Francisco, the mayor's office was giving a kind of covert okay to vigilantes going around in 1934 and busting up any kind of left organization offices. They broke up the Communist Party's offices. They broke up their newspapers' offices. They did the same thing in Oakland and scattered around in the Bay Area. Any group on the left was likely to get a vigilante raid beginning in early July and continuing for a couple of weeks afterwards. And what would happen as soon as these vigilantes raided a place is that the police would show up right after the vigilantes left and then arrest anyone who happened to be inside and charge them with vagrancy. So there's, it's clear that there's a complicity between the police and probably the city administration and these unknown vigilantes, whoever they may have been. But that kind of died down after the strike ended. It's not until about 1937-38 that a kind of new Red Scare ramps up in Washington with the creation of what was initially the House Special Committee on Un-American Activities, which started holding hearings, especially alleging that the union movement was filled with communists and that it was a danger to the country and so forth. And not coincidentally, it's in the midst of that Commissioner Lerman decided that there was communist propaganda in Coit Tower. Once the United States and the Soviet Union became allies in World War II, there was a little bit of a tamping down of that kind of Red Scare thing. But at the end of World War II, it flowered again and sort of reached its peak under McCarthy, when again there were demands to get rid of the communist propaganda in Coit Tower. Yes?
Well, if you were an abstract painter of some kind and you applied to be a part of one of these
Project.
teams, would you have been rejected by whatever the selection process?
You would have been encouraged to do more representational art, to do American scene, because, you know, they were working on commission. And when you work on commission, if you're an artist working on commission, you don't have complete freedom. Nonetheless, if you look at the whole range of New Deal art, there's nothing abstract in the post offices that I've ever seen. But some of the WPA fine arts projects did include abstract work. And if you go to Coit Tower and go up to the second floor and go all the way at the end of the corridor on the second floor to the room that Jane Berlandina did, it's clearly not anything like the rest of the murals at Coit Tower. It's not the same palette. It's not the same kind of representational art. It's not completely abstract, but it's a much more impressionistic kind of art than any of the rest of the art there. So that kind of work did show up in New Deal projects, even at Coit Tower. But it's fairly unusual. And just remember, all of these artists are working on commission. And when you work on commission, generally you and the person giving the commission have to agree on the subject matter and the approach and all of that sort of thing. So it's not as though these artists in the New Deal art projects had complete freedom to do whatever they wanted. Other questions or comments? Yeah, Michael.
So how many of them had experience with this, or is it, do you call it
Fresco.
fresco art technique? Because that's a very technical
It
method,
is.
isn't it?
Well, it was a fairly unusual method at the time. It had been popularized by the work of the Mexican muralists in the 1920s, and a number of San Francisco artists had gone to Mexico to watch the Mexican muralists, especially Rivera, at work. Victor Arnautoff had spent 2 years as an assistant to Rivera, so he was absolutely familiar with it. Bernard Zackheim knew about it, but he went to Hungary to learn how to do it. Some of the other artists had, Maxine Albro and Parker Hall. Maxine Albro did the big agriculture mural on the main floor. Parker Hall did the collegiate sports on the second floor. They were a couple, and they had gone to Mexico together to watch Rivera working, and then they had taken some lessons from one of Rivera's disciples on how to do this technique, and she had done some such murals previous to Coit Tower. Arnautoff had done some before Coit Tower. Zackheim had done one at the Jewish Community Center, the old building that's since demolished, but that mural was put into the new building somewhere. I haven't seen it when I've been there. I've always wanted to go looking for it. I don't know where they put it, but it's not in an obvious place, I guess. So some of them had that kind of experience beforehand. Ray Boynton, who did the one as you walk in the main door, it's right in front of you. He was a faculty member at the California School of Fine Arts, and he had started working in fresco 10, 15 years before this. He was, I think, probably the first person on the West Coast to begin working in fresco, but he was really unusual in that regard. Nonetheless, he was teaching fresco at the California School of Fine Arts, and when Arnautoff was a student there, he took the class, he did a fresco painting. It's still there in the old Cathedral of the Virgin on Fulton Street. It's way up in the choir loft. But then Arnautoff went to Mexico and worked with Rivera, and he said in his memoirs something like, "This isn't anything like what I learned to do at the California School of Fine Arts," because what Boynton had them doing was just taking a little thing like this and putting wet plaster on it and making it more or less like an easel painting, but doing it on wet plaster. It wasn't like doing a whole wall the way the Mexican muralists did and the way that they did at Coit Tower. So there may have been some of the other people there who had taken Boynton's class. But the most experienced ones were Albro, Arnautoff, Zackheim, and Boynton. Yeah.
Doing something that large, they must have had to work out sketches and have them approved.
Oh, yes.
And then did they square it off and do
Oh,
it in
yes.
that technique?
Yes, yes, yes. It's a very complex process. It started with little sketches. You can see their sketches, and first sketches and then watercolors. And many of those are still available for researchers at the Palace of the Legion of Honor, at the Achenbach Foundation of Graphic Arts. But then once those initial sketches were approved, you put them on the entire wall. Outlines, these are just outlines. And then the way that this was, that you would turn that into a painting is that you could only work on about a square yard a day, because you put in that much plaster and then you have to work very quickly until the plaster dries, and that's about one day's work. So they would take paper, tracing paper, and put it over the sketch and draw on the sketching paper the outline that's behind that on the wall. Then you take the sketching paper and put little pinholes on all the lines, and then you put that up on the wall, and you blow carbon powder, charcoal, through the pinholes onto the wall, take off the tracing paper, and you've got the outline that you're going to work with that day. Now, I last Friday I did those sketching papers are called the cartoons. When I was, I did a program with KQED Forum on Friday, and one of the people who called in said that he is a photographer, and he had several years ago photographed Bernard Zackheim's cartoons for the Coit Tower mural. And so they apparently still existed at that time, but they would be, really big things. There's some great photographs at the San Francisco MoMA, not publicly available photographs, but in their collection, that shows the artists at work, and it shows various stages. So, this part of it is done, and here's a part over here that says plaster tomorrow, and it has an outline. And so that's where the fresh plaster would go that next day. They always tried to make the different parts of of a day's work correspond to some line in the final painting, so that you don't see a line in the plaster. But if you look really carefully, you can find some of them, because the more experienced artists, it's hard to find. I can't find them in Arnautoff's. But in some of the others, some of these people were just learning how to do this at Coit Tower, some of the younger ones especially. And you can find some of the lines between different days' work if you know where to look.
Did the artists do their own plastering?
No, there was a special plasterer. Matthew Barnes did the plastering. He had done the plastering for Diego Rivera at the California School of Fine Arts. And if you know that enormous Diego Rivera that was at SF MoMA, Pan American Unity mural that was at SF MoMA, he did the plastering for that. He was the plasterer for mural painters. And he appears. Diego Rivera put real people in his murals. So at Coit Tower, you'll see Ralph Stackpole, you'll see Arthur Brown Jr., you'll see Diego Rivera himself, and you'll see Matthew Barnes putting in some plaster. And people at Coit Tower did the same thing. They put actual people in, and especially they put in each other. So several of the artists there depicted Ralph Stackpole. Victor Arnautoff did a self-portrait and put his son Michael. Who was it that, Danny, you didn't know Michael, I don't think, but Michael was his oldest son. And he put Michael in as a newsboy selling a newspaper. Zackheim put in his daughter. Otis Oldfield put in both of his daughters. And Lucien Lebeau also put in the Oldfield girls in his mural, along with their mother. Lucien Lebeau included Maxine Albro and Parker Hall, who I told you were a couple, and they're a couple in Lebeau's mural. If you're really interested in identifying the people that appear in the murals, like the ones examples I've given you, there's a book by Masha Zackheim that's now out of print, but she was the daughter of Bernard Zackheim. She was able to interview many of these artists for her book, and she has a pretty good list of where the different artists show up in those murals. One of the reasons that I finally decided to do this book was that her book was out of print. And I did make some inquiries about whether it was possible to get it back into print, and I finally gave up on that and decided I had to do it myself. Other questions or comments? Yes, go ahead.
Quick one. Do you think that they were paid well for their work, or was it sort of, just enough?
It was work relief. It was $1 an hour for a 30-hour week, and they all worked a lot more than 30 hours. The person who first proposed this to President Roosevelt was George Biddle. George Biddle had been a classmate of Roosevelt's at their prep school. And Biddle was an artist himself and was very impressed with the Mexican muralists. And he wrote President Roosevelt a letter in early 1933 and said, there's really spectacular work going on in Mexico. These Mexican muralists, they are creating a whole new kind of art. We can do that here. We can put artists to work for plumbers' wages, that's his quote, and create a whole new kind of art that makes it available to ordinary people. But his term was plumber's wages, I think, at a time when plumbers weren't getting paid very well.
So what would the equivalent? So they were making $30 a week.
Yeah.
So what was a longshoreman making at that time, for example? Or what was what was a clerk making?
Well, you're asking me to pull some numbers out of my head that I'm having trouble with. I do, somewhere in the dim recesses, I could tell you what a longshoreman was making at the time. But let me see if I can come up with it off the top of my head. This was one of their demands in 1934, was wages. and I don't trust what I'm remembering. It's in my book, but it's 2 books away.
But $30 a week sounds okay.
I think it was. I think, given the Depression, I think it was. It would put food on their table and maybe even help pay for a roof over their head.
Well, Google says it would be worth $706 today.
Okay. Okay, other questions or comments?
Can you talk a little bit about when the research started for this project, or how much did it just come out of a lot of things you had already written?
Sure. Well, it's a little hard to say when it started, because when I first started teaching at San Francisco State, my field of teaching and was the same as my field of research, and it was the U.S. from the Civil War to World War I. So that's where my research was at that time. But beginning in the 1980s, I began really focusing on the 1930s. And at some point, as I was doing that, I started teaching our senior seminar on topics related to the Great Depression. And I would take my students to Coit Tower to see the artwork there. And I don't remember how this connection was made, but at some point Masha Zakheim gave me a personal tour of the murals and then gave me a copy of her book. And that really opened up my eyes about that artwork. But I had other things in the works. You know, my Harry Bridges book was a priority for me. And I did research. I was still doing a lot of research for that's the whole reason I ended up focusing on the 1930s, was that Nikki Bridges called me one day and said, "Would you like to write a biography of Harry?" And I gave that only a very little bit of thought before saying yes. But research on the 1930s ends up, really sort of spinning in all kinds of directions. And one direction that it spun was to get me interested in Victor Arnautoff. I had, as part of my research on Harry Bridges, I spent a semester as a Fulbright instructor at Moscow State University, and I spent 2 or 3 days every week in the archives in Moscow, the archives of the American Communist Party, trying to figure out just what Harry Bridges' relationship was to the American Communist Party. There wasn't anything in that archive that particularly helped with that, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff in that archive about the Communist Party in California. And so I kind of thought, well, there could be a book there someday. And so I took a lot of notes about it. And my experience in Russia and my research on the 1930s at some point led me to Victor Arnautoff, who was born in Russia. And then once he retired from Stanford, he went back to the Soviet Union and lived out his life there. And so at some point, I agreed to do a lecture about Victor Arnautoff's mural at the Presidio. I just knew at the time that he had done a mural at the Presidio. I hadn't even seen it. But I said, okay, I'll do a lecture on this for a fundraiser for the Historical Association. And so I ordered Victor Arnautoff's papers from the Archives of American Art. They sent me a roll of microfilm. I spent the summer cranking through the microfilm and decided this is really interesting. So I started gathering material for something about Victor Arnautoff, which turned out to be a book. And in the process, I did a lot of reading and research about Arnautoff's work at Coit Tower. And so there's a fairly large section in that book about Coit Tower. And then I finished that book. I finished the Bridges book. I finished this book. And then I thought, what am I going to do now? And I did, at that point, try to figure out if it was possible to reprint Masha Zockheim's book, which had gone out of print. She had died. By that time, her sister, who was the publisher of the book, had also died. Ruth Zockheim's son, Adam, was also the publisher, but he had retired. And it just didn't seem like there was any way that it was going to be possible to republish that book. And so that's the point at which I decided I will talk to my publisher and see if I can interest them in a book about the Coit Tower murals. So that long answer to your question.
Are there art historians that were helpful to you that were looking at it really from their point of view?
Well, I certainly read a number of them. I read a number of art historians who had dealt with it. I really ended up disagreeing significantly with one of them, which you will see if you read the book. But I just soon not go into it now.
Who wrote, like at the beach chalet downstairs? There's a lot of documentation of what's in that art.
Yes.
Do you know who did those notes?
Who did the notes? I do not know. I know who did the ones at Coit Tower. The ones at Coit Tower were done by Harvey Smith, who's a friend of mine who lives in Berkeley. But I don't know who did the documentation at the beach chalet, and they are very nice notes. They're very helpful, I think. Lucien Lebeau was so good at having identifiable people in all of his work. So if you go to the beach chalet, you know, you can pick out lots of people that are clearly identifiable. He put himself with his back to you, unfortunately. But Mayor Rossi is right there. You can certainly see Angelo Rossi in those murals. And LeBeau's murals at Coit Tower are the same way. So many of the faces in his mural are identifiable people. And he did this huge mural in the library at George Washington High School. And again, almost every figure in that is historical, but identifiable, because he just really tried to recreate actual people in his murals. Other questions, comments? Well, I think we're done then. Thank you all.
So a reminder, and you may want to say something about the 23rd when you
Oh.
address that.
Yeah. So we were going to do both of these books tonight initially.
That was probably a bad idea.
But yeah, I think we've taken plenty of. So I'm going to come back, and Eric will have some copies of this available, and we can talk about it. And it, you know, the title tells you San Francisco Reds, Communists in the Bay Area, 1919 to 1958. And what I do in the book is to trace a number of actual people, some of whom I know and knew. Why did they join? What did they do? How did this affect their lives? And in probably 2/3 of the cases, why did they leave? Because the end date here is the date when there were massive resignations from the party in this area and across the country, but here too.
By the way, I Googled, in 1933, longshoremen in the Pacific Coast ports earned $1 per hour with time and a half for overtime. They
Yeah.
also worked a 6-hour day and 30-hour week.
That was what they got in their contract. That was the contract they got in 34. The 6-hour day was it seemed like pie in the sky. But that was it was kind of a common idea that if you did a 30-hour week instead of a 45 or 48-hour week, which would have been more typical, 6 days, 8 hours a day, If you broke up the work that way, there would be more jobs because at a time of massive unemployment, the 30-hour week was seen as a way of sharing the work. But of course, they never did work a 6-hour day. They always worked an 8-hour day, and they got 2 hours of overtime that way.
Thank you very
All
much.
right.
Mhm. We'll stick around, chat with Professor Cherny, and I'll open a second bottle of wine.
Mike Miller.
Oh, Mike.
see
Hey,
you.
I didn't recognize you.
Well, we're all getting old.
We are. Oh, it's so good
We
to
aren't
see you.
getting anymore. We are.
We are. That's exactly right. We are. Yeah, it's good to see you.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful presentation.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. Have
How's
you?
Rebecca?
She's doing well.
Give her my best.
I will. I'll do that.
Yeah.
I'll do that.
So you're right. You're really staying at the typewriter or at the computer.
Well,
huh?
but see, I've run out of archival research. I've used it all up, and I've got one more book.